Welcome to another episode of The Dissection. Today, we are talking about the DRC. The story of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a story of greed, it's a story of failure of leadership, and it's a story of failure of conflict resolution and global exploitation. This week, things have escalated significantly in the DRC, and the issues in the DRC actually concern several African countries, including South Africa. This crisis in the DRC is so bad that it could lead to multiple countries waging an all-out war in the DRC. And realistically and pragmatically, we should all be paying attention to it because it is a significant moment in African history. Last night, the president of Rwanda basically issued what should be considered to be a threat to the president of South Africa and South Africa. This episode is going to look at that moment and as many elements as possible. So as I've said, the issue of the DRC is a big one, and it's one that all Africans should be paying attention to. It's also something which is going to be a big test for America, for Donald Trump, for his new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. What happens in the Democratic Republic of the Congo affects African countries, but it also affects American companies like Tesla, like Apple Computers. So as things stand, 13 South African soldiers have been killed in recent conflict in the DRC, which occurred over the weekend. And this has sparked a discussion in South Africa about what those soldiers are doing there, if they were given adequate support to carry out their mission, and if those soldiers should be there and whether they should withdraw altogether. The other major question is if there is any possibility at this point of war between South Africa and Rwanda. Let's talk about the DRC moment, this crisis, and think about it looking at the DRC itself. The DRC is supposed to be the richest nation in Africa. But right now, the GDP per capita income in the DRC is $627, which is extremely low, lower than the sub-Saharan African average. In comparison, the GDP per capita income in Rwanda is $1,000. In South Africa, it's $6,000 US dollars. In Uganda, it's $1,000. And in sub-Saharan Africa as a group, it's $1,600. So you can see that the DRC is extremely low in comparison with its neighboring countries, with the region. Instead of being the richest country in Africa, the DRC has been mired in conflict, and this conflict has effectively set back not only the DRC, but the whole continent. Because you need to appreciate the DRC is at the center of Africa, and if the center cannot hold, the continent cannot prosper. Some information about this country. It has a population of 115 million people, which is a sizable population and puts it at number 4 after Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Egypt. So not only is it a vast landmass, it is also a large population living in that particular country. The DRC has vast mineral resources and is also one of the most fertile places on earth. It has been blessed not only with mineral wealth, but also with agricultural fertility that is very rare to find in that level of exuberance anywhere on earth. Agricultural products that the country currently produces, but it could produce much more: cassava, plantains, sugarcane, oil palm, all palm fruit, maize, rice, root vegetables, bananas, sweet potatoes, groundnuts. You can literally grow anything in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's that large, it's that fertile. Their mineral resources, which have gotten them into a lot of trouble and have caused many of the issues which we'll talk about today, include copper, cobalt, gold, diamonds, coltan, zinc, tungsten. The DRC is extremely rich in mineral resources, and this wealth that it has made it a site of contestation for decades. Who are its export destinations? It exports to China, 55% of its export. There's cobalt, gold, whatever. 55% are going to China. Singapore, 5%. UAE, 5%. Hong Kong, 4%. And Tanzania, 4%. It imports from 5 countries in the main. China at 33%. Zambia, 10%. South Africa, 10%. The United Arab Emirates, 5%. And India at 4%. And this is 2022 data, right? So you can appreciate already that these countries have a role to play in what is happening, right? I want to focus, though, the mineral discussion on cobalt, because cobalt is the new oil. Cobalt is extremely important to the present and the future of the world, not just one country, not just one industry. It is important to the future of the world. As things stand, cobalt is a key mineral in the manufacture of electric vehicles. Cobalt makes the batteries of these cars go further without needing a charge, right? So these Teslas, these BYD vehicles, all these electric vehicles you see all of these companies making, they do need cobalt in those batteries. It's also used as a component in smartphone batteries and computers. The DRC, as one country, has over 2/3 of the world's entire supply of cobalt. Close to 70% of all cobalt which was produced last year comes from the DRC. And not only that, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has more cobalt in its tailing pipes, which are the mounds of mineral waste left after mining other minerals, than most countries have in their entire landmass. The trash that comes from mining other minerals has more cobalt in it than some countries have in their entire landmass. That's how much cobalt there is in the DRC. The quality of cobalt in the DRC is extremely high, and the mineral is easy to mine at the present moment. You know, there are different types of mining. You've got surface mining, underground mining, you name it. But you can literally mine cobalt with a shovel in many parts of the DRC. And many people are actually doing that in towns like Kolwezi in DRC. So Zama Zama mining, as it's known in South Africa, is widespread in the DRC. This Zama Zama mining is often called artisanal mining in other places, and it's also called subsistence mining. Artisanal mining is this type of subsistence mining where individuals extract minerals using basic tools and methods. It's also known as small-scale mining, right? Artisanal miners typically work independently without official employment by a mining company. They use basic tools and methods to extract minerals from the surface or shallow depths. Artisanal mining can involve the extracting of minerals such as gold, diamonds, and coal, but predominantly in the DRC, cobalt is the mineral that artisanal miners are working on. The problem and the challenge with artisanal mining is that it often involves children. Child labor is one of the biggest problems in mining in the DRC, and some of these big mining companies and big entities come to the DRC to buy this cobalt from these artisanal miners very exploitatively at very cheap prices, because they know that these guys are using this cobalt to support their families in very poor environments and can be taken advantage of. So we've got a broad picture now of the DRC, but what's happening? What has been happening? This is the latest report on what has been happening, but we're going to be looking at who are the actors, what is the history, what are the stakes, what needs to be done. All of that is going to be covered in this particular episode. But let's jump to the latest report on the DRC. There has been conflict for years in the eastern part of the DRC, particularly in the area called Kivu, which is divided into Northern Kivu and Southern Kivu. These provinces, North Kivu, Southern Kivu, are in the DRC and they are right next to Rwanda. And there are multiple rebel groups that operate in that part of the country. We'll talk about those multiple rebel groups a little bit later. It's coming soon. Earlier this month, the M23 fighters captured the towns of Minova, Gadali, and Masisi. Then they went a little bit further and they captured, right, Sake, which is a town about 15 miles away from Goma. Now, Sake is significant because there's a South African military base operating in Sake. After they had captured Sake, they went on to capture Goma. Fighters from the M23 rebel group have now claimed to have taken over this eastern city of Goma, which is a critical city in the Kivu provinces, North Kivu, Southern Kivu. Goma is the big city there. Goma is the capital and largest city of the North Kivu province in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is situated on the northern shore of Lake Kivu. But even people from Southern Kivu often go and find work in Goma, etc. So the population of the city is nearly 2 million people. It's a significant size. Some of the groups that live in Goma include Tutsis, include Rwandi, something of that nature. I'm mispronouncing it, but these are people of Rwandan descent. They also live in that city, along with other tribes as well. But it's going to matter why I've mentioned the Tutsis as well as the Barwandis in that discussion a little bit later. So M23 released a statement on X a few days ago saying, we urge all residents of Goma to remain calm. The liberation of the city has been successfully carried out and the situation is under control. It was in this fight for Sake and Goma where 13 South African soldiers were killed. There are conflicting reports about who killed the South African soldiers. One side is alleging that it was the M23 fighters that killed the soldiers, and the other side is alleging that it was the DRC army, the FARDC, which killed the soldiers. The president of South Africa actually had a phone call with the president of Rwanda. And for a moment, it seemed as if everything was going to stabilize and that things would calm down until Wednesday, when things took a sharp turn. I'm recording this on Thursday, the 30th of January. Wednesday, the 29th of January, is where things took a bit of a rough turn, and we're going to talk about that right now. So on Wednesday, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, issued a statement on X, and this is what he said in his statement. Fellow South Africans, following the recent intensification of the fighting in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Africa has lost 13 brave soldiers who were dedicated to their mission and committed to peace. The fighting is the result of an escalation by the rebel group M23 and the Rwanda Defense Force militia, engaging the armed forces of the DRC, the FARDC, and attacking peacekeepers from the SADC mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the SAMI DRC. On behalf of the government and the people of our country, I express our deepest condolences to their families, their loved ones, and colleagues. We bow our heads in honor of their heroic and gallant fight for peace. We honor them and mourn them. All necessary support is being provided to the families of the deceased and the families of the injured. The process to repatriate the remains of the deceased is underway. The attacks on peacekeepers resulted in the deaths of SAMI DRC members from other troop contributing countries, namely Malawi and Tanzania, as well as members of the UN Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC, MONUSCO Brigade. We honor all the lives that were lost and pass our condolences to their families, governments, and citizens. The situation in Goma and Sake, where our troops and their counterparts are stationed, remains very tense, volatile, and unpredictable. The Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, Ms. Angie Musheka, and the Chief of the South African National Defense Forces, General Rudzani Mapanywa, and the SAMI DRC Force Commander, Major General Monabisi Dakupu, are working to ensure that the SAMI DRC forces remain well equipped and sufficiently supported during this critical mission. He went on to say, we are concerned about the speculation about the state of our troops and battle conditions. All South Africans must rally behind our brave men and women who have dedicated their lives to bringing peace in our continent. South Africa's military presence in the Eastern DRC is not a declaration of war against any country or state. The members of the South African National Defense Force that are in DRC are part of both the SADC and United Nations efforts to bring peace and protect thousands of lives that are constantly threatened in the conflict in the DRC. The presence of the SAMI DRC forces demonstrates a commitment of SADC member states to supporting the DRC in its efforts to achieve lasting peace and stability and ultimately create an enabling environment for sustainable development and prosperity. We welcome the position that was recently adopted by the United Nations Security Council during its special sitting on the situation in DRC, which calls for an immediate end to hostilities, the reversal of territorial expansion by the M23, the exit of external forces from the DRC, and the resumption of peace talks under the Nairobi process. The territorial integrity of the DRC must be respected in accordance with the United Nations Charter on the respect of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of other nations. We call on all parties to this conflict to fully embrace the current diplomatic efforts that are aimed at finding a peaceful resolution, including honoring the Rwanda process agreements, we must silence the guns on our continent for the attainment of inclusive development and prosperity. I thank you. That's what the president of South Africa issued as a statement. That evening, close to midnight, the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, issued a statement quoting, so it was a statement above the statement, quoting on Twitter what basically was said by the president of South Africa. And he was saying, in a nutshell, "Awungitsheli lokho. Awungitsheli lokho." That's what he was saying. Very provocative, his move. Very provocative. This is what he said. This is Kagame now. His statement. "I held 2 conversations this week with President Ramaphosa on the situation in the Eastern DRC, including earlier today. What has been said about these conversations in the media by South African officials and President Ramaphosa himself contains a lot of distortion, deliberate attacks, and even lies. If words can change so much from a conversation to a public statement, it says a lot about how these very important issues are being managed. A few clarifications for the record. Number 1, the Rwanda Defense Force is an army, not a militia. Number 2, SAMI DRC is not a peacekeeping force, and it has no place in this situation. It was authorized by SADC as a belligerent force engaging in offensive combat operations to help the DRC government fight against its own people, working alongside genocidal armed groups like the FDLR, which target Rwanda, while also threatening to take the war to Rwanda itself. 3. SAMI DRC displaced a true peacekeeping force, the East African Community Regional Force, and this contributed to the failure of the negotiation process. 4. President Ramaphosa has never given a warning of any kind, unless it was delivered in his local and language, which I do not understand. He did not ask for support to ensure he did ask for support to ensure the South African force has adequate electricity, food, and water, which we shall help communicate. 5. President Ramaphosa confirmed to me that M23 did not kill the soldiers from South Africa, but the FARDC did. 6. If South Africa wants to contribute to peaceful solutions, that is well and good, but South Africa is in no position to take on the role of peacemaker or mediator, and if South Africa prefers confrontation, Rwanda will deal with the matter in that context any day. These are not peacemaking words from the president of Rwanda. I've ended these statements now. They're not. Let's go back to this particular opening paragraph. He says, "I had 2 conversations. What has been said about these conversations in the media by South African officials and President Ramaphosa himself contains a lot of distortion, deliberate attacks, and even lies." That is a big confrontational opening paragraph. Then he goes to number 6. If South Africa wants to contribute to peaceful solutions, that is well and good. But South Africa is in no position to take on the role of peacemaker or mediator. And if South Africa prefers confrontation, Rwanda will take the matter in that context any day. These are not diplomatic words at all. In the diplomatic community, people are generally expected to speak a certain way to each other, to manage their language, to manage their rhetoric. What we are seeing from Paul Kagame is the very opposite of that. It's not diplomatic language in any fashion, and it's very chilling when you think about that. It's coming from a man who spent a large part of his early years in the bushes fighting a war, fighting against a genocide that was happening in his country. This is a man with military experience, a man who has a large command of his army in Rwanda, and that army is one of the best trained military entities on the continent of Africa, right? They're a feared army, to be quite honest. And for him to be saying this is very chilling. So I don't want to underplay everything that has happened here. This moment, yesterday, these exchanges on social media were a diplomatic fallout of grave proportions. There are various claims and counterclaims which have been made by both South Africa and Rwanda, which need to be examined. Number 1, we need to know who killed the South African soldiers. Number 2, we need to know what is the clear role and activity of the Sami DRC forces. Number 3, we need to know what is the clear role and activity of the Rwandan Defense Forces in the DRC. We need to know what is M23 doing in the DRC, the Eastern DRC, and why. Why was it important for them to seize Goma, to seize Saki, and other parts of Eastern DRC? Before we go further and deeper into these questions, it's important, it's vital that we add some historical context to this dissection. As the saying goes, William Faulkner once said, "The past is never dead. In fact, it is not even past." And we need to be cognizant of that. Okay, so let's talk about the history of the DRC and some critical moments which will help us understand everything that's going on in the DRC. Right. The Democratic Republic of the Congo has been plagued by a series of civil wars and conflicts that have devastated the country and destabilized the entire Great Lakes region. The DRC's civil wars were amongst the deadliest in modern history, with millions of lives lost due to violence, disease, and starvation. We're going to start off with the colonial legacy. The DRC was colonized by Belgium, and it was formerly known as the Belgian Congo. It was exploited for its vast natural resources under colonial rule. There were brutal practices under King Leopold II, and later, the Belgian administration itself sowed seeds of instability in the country. The DRC gained independence in 1960, but weak institutions, ethnic tensions, and external interference from Belgium and the CIA of the USA made the DRC a fragile and failed state from the get-go. Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was assassinated on January 17, 1961. We're in January, talking about the DRC, right? 64 years later. And we are still talking about turmoil and conflict in the DRC. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated on January 17, 1961. And this was during a tumultuous period, right, following the country's independence from Belgium. Following the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in January, the political landscape in the Democratic Republic of the Congo became increasingly chaotic. Lumumba had been a significant figure opposing the secession of the mineral-rich province of Katanga in the DRC, which had attempted to declare independence on the 11th of July, 1960, with support from who? Belgium, the CIA, and local elites, right? The death of Lumumba removed a key obstacle to foreign interests that sought to maintain control over Congo's resources, to keep resources for global industrialization cheap. One of the countries that had to remain a failed state is the DRC. We have to appreciate that. It wasn't by accident that the DRC was destabilized. It wasn't by accident that all of these dynamics were introduced into the DRC. In fact, to keep Africa fragmented, one of the states that has to remain underdeveloped is the DRC. The DRC, as things stand, has bad roads, poor infrastructure, poor electricity supply, poor water supply. If it had good road and rail networks at this point, traveling across Africa would be much easier, and trade in Africa would be much easier because you could move those goods on those trains through the DRC. The DRC is the center of Africa. And this has always been understood by the global elites and the political elites, right? Even in Africa, from Mugabe to Museveni to Kagame to Motlanthe to Ramaphosa. All these African old men have had their eyes and hands in the DRC. All of them. Do not underestimate the value of the DRC. China is in DRC. America is in DRC. And they are not there because Africa is poor, Africa is not valuable. They're there because they know the value. Oftentimes, people try to make us feel like we have no value in Africa. If we don't know our value, we are easier to exploit. If we don't know our value, we're easier to cheat, to abuse, to divide. If we are not united, we are easier to take advantage of. If we are fighting each other, those minerals keep flowing because artisanal miners will keep trying to feed their families. Artisanal miners will keep trying to make ends meet. These are the challenges that we face in Africa on the ground. So, after the fall of Lumumba and the crisis in the DRC, what happened is that a dictator arose, Mobutu Sese Seko, and he governed the DRC from 1965 till 1997, which is basically 32 years. After a series of coups and crises post-independence, Mobutu Sese Seko seized power and established a kleptocratic regime, which was supported and backed by the Americans. Mobutu's corrupt leadership exacerbated economic decline, it fueled ethnic tensions, and it weakened state institutions, and it set the stage, critically, for future conflicts. A war broke out in the DRC in the 90s, and this war is referred to as the First Congo War. The trigger for the First Congo War is the following. The Rwandan Genocide of 1994 displaced millions of people from Rwanda, with Hutu militias fleeing to eastern Zaire, which is the DRC. These militias used refugee camps as bases to launch attacks on Rwanda, and that caused destabilization in the region. Rwanda and Uganda, under the leaders of Paul Kagame and Yoweri Museveni, backed a rebellion which was led by Laurent Kabila to overthrow Mobutu. These countries, Rwanda and Uganda, have often had interactions and engagements with the DRC. The course of the war went as follows. The Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, the AFDL, led by Kabila, advanced across Zaire with the support from Rwanda, Uganda, and other regional actors. Mobutu's regime collapsed due to its unpopularity, lack of military strength, and that led to Kabila's takeover in 1997, and the country was renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Right? That happened in 1997. Shortly thereafter, another war broke out in 1998, and this war lasted until 2003. So the causes of this war are as follows, and it's known as the Second Congo War. After coming into power, Laurent Kabila distanced himself from Rwandan and Ugandan allies, and he expelled Rwandan troops. And this led to a new rebellion, which was supported by Rwanda and Uganda. So what Kabila then did is that he got involvement from Angola, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and other countries which backed him. And this turned the conflict into a regional war. This Second Congo War is often referred to as Africa's World War, and it involved 9 African nations and multiple armed groups. The fighting was concentrated in the eastern DRC, with competing factions vying for control of the lucrative resources such as gold, diamonds, and coltan. The war left 5.4 million people dead, not always directly from conflict, but from disease and starvation. There were widespread atrocities, including mass killings, sexual violence, and the use of child soldiers. The war was resolved in the following way. Laurent Kabila was assassinated in 2001 and succeeded by his son, Joseph Kabila. Right? There was a Lusaka ceasefire agreement which was signed in 1999, and there were subsequent peace processes which culminated in the Sun City Agreement in 2002, and this led to the withdrawal of foreign troops. A transitional government was established in 2003. So you can see now, Abo Mugabe are now in this thing, Namibia now in this thing, and that peace process in Sun City was in South Africa under Thabo Mbeki's time, right? So that's one side of it. But as you've seen, the Rwanda issue, the genocide issue, all of these things have links to DRC and the conflict that is going on now. So it's important to also understand the history of Rwanda and to look at the links between Rwanda and the DRC. So let's talk about the Rwandan genocide. That's a critical moment. The Rwandan genocide took place between April and July of 1994. And it was one of the most horrific events in the 20th century. In just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people, and some estimates go as high as 1 million Tutsi people, along with moderate Hutus who opposed the activities, were systematically murdered. It was a massive genocide. 800,000 to 1 million people killed in a few days, 100 days. That is one of the most gruesome moments in global history. And the context of this Rwandan genocide is as follows. Rwanda's population, historically, was composed primarily of Hutu people, who comprised 85% of the country, and Tutsi people, who comprised 40%, and Twa, 1%. Historically, these groups were social categories rather than distinct ethnicities. Under Belgian colonial rule, which occurred between 1919 and 1962, these divisions were formalized and deepened, with Tutsi being favored for leadership and education, and this caused resentment amongst the Hutu majority. Rwanda gained independence in 1962, and Hutu leaders came into power and implemented policies of discrimination against the Tutsi. This led also to waves of violence against the Tutsi in the decades leading up to the genocide, and it strained relations. In 1990, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was composed largely of exiled Tutsis who were living where? In the DRC and Uganda, launched a military campaign to overthrow the Hutu-led government. The resulting civil war exacerbated tensions, with extremist Hutu leaders blaming the Tutsis for the country's problems. So the civil war starts in 1990. The trigger event of the genocide is the assassination of the president, Habyarimana. So I don't think I'm saying this guy's name properly. Habyarimana. I don't know. You guys know the president of Rwanda in 1994 on April 6th. A plane that was carrying the president was shot down, and it killed everyone on board. The perpetrators are still unidentified up until now. But what happened is that Hutu extremists used the event as a pretext to launch the genocide, and they claimed that it was orchestrated by the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and their Tutsi supporters. So what happened is that the genocide ensued. There was government organization. The genocide was highly organized, with government officials, the military, and militias, notably the Interahamwe, who played key roles. There was propaganda that was distributed via state-controlled media, which dehumanized the Tutsis and called them all manner of names, including cockroaches. Tutsis were the primary targets, but moderate Hutus as well were targeted and killed. The massacres were carried out in homes, in churches, in schools, in public places. Entire families were wiped out. There was a lot of sexual abuse that occurred as a weapon of war, with thousands of Tutsi women systematically assaulted. The international community did not act in time. Despite warnings from the UN officials and human rights organizations, the international community failed to intervene effectively. The UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda, the UNAMIR, was limited in its scope and mandate, and its forces were drastically reduced after the genocide began. The end of this genocide is important to talk about because it left some issues which continued to cause aggravation in this region. The genocide ended after the Rwandan Patriotic Front won the war, right? The RPF, led by Paul Kagame, captured Kigali and overthrew the Hutu-led government in July of 1994. This event forced millions of Hutu refugees, including many perpetrators of the genocide, to flee into neighboring countries like Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Later, some of these individuals and communities formed the FLDR. The FLDR are the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda. This is a French name, so it's not going to, the acronym doesn't translate. Sorry, FDLR, right? I think that's correct. The FDLR is an armed group formed in 2000 and is primarily composed of ethnic Hutu fighters who fled the Democratic Republic of the Congo after the 1994 genocide. The FDLR seeks to overthrow the current Rwandan government led by the Tutsi-dominated Patriotic Front, right, and return Hutu leaders to power. Despite significant military setbacks and leadership arrests, it remains active, and it is involved in serious human rights violations, including attacks on civilians and recruitment of child soldiers. So this issue of the FLDR continues to be an enemy. It continues to be something that causes conflict between the Rwandan government and the DRC government. It's a pain point because Paul Kagame feels as if you are hosting Hutu rebels who killed my people, who want to kill us and destabilize our country. And in the other side, there's the issue of these M23 fighters, who are often referred to as the M23 rebels. Who are the M23 rebels? The M23 rebel group rose to prominence a decade ago when its fighters seized Goma in 2012. It derives its name from the March 23, 2009 peace deal. And they use that date because they say that the Congolese government did not implement the peace deal. They reneged on the peace deal, the March 23 peace deal, which is why they are M23. The M23 comes from a group known as the National Congress for the Defense of the People. And this group, what you need to know about the CNDP, the Congress for the Defense of the People, the politics of the CNDP were primarily centered around protecting the interests of the Tutsi minority in the Eastern Congo and addressing grievances against the Congolese government. The CNDP's roots can be traced back to Laurent Nkunda's involvement with the Congolese Rally for Democracy, the RCD, which was a rebel group supported by Rwanda during the Second Congo War. After the war, Nkunda became increasingly concerned about the safety of Tutsis in Eastern DRC, particularly following the Sun City Agreement, the 2003 Sun City Agreement in South Africa, which aimed to integrate various armed groups into the Congolese National Army. Nkunda refused to join this integration process due to fears for his community's safety and potential war crime charges against him. So this CNDP then became March 23 after the peace deal was basically, in their view, reneged upon, right? The deal in 2009, which was signed, was that there would be provisions for the CNDP to transform into a political party. There would be a release of its imprisoned prisoners, and there would be a reintegration of refugees and the integration of the CNDP members into government institutions and the Congolese army. This did not happen. And this is what then led to them seizing Goma in 2012, saying that the deal had not been entered into, had not been honored, rather, by the government of the DRC. And it's important, I think, just to put aside as a note as well, that the Eastern DRC, as you can see, has been a site of the Congo War, the Congo Wars. It's been a large part of the contestation, and there are many rebel groups there. Some rebel groups, people say, are supported by Rwanda. We know that the FDLR are also operating in that part of the country, and they are considered to be enemies of Rwanda. So you can see that there are issues in this country and in Rwanda that stem from the instability caused in the DRC, that stem from the Rwandan genocide, that stem from the civil war in Rwanda. These issues are intertwined. It's not a simple case. And this is, I think, part of what explains these heightened emotions in the DRC. But of course, minerals also play a part in all of this. The story of DRC is the story of a country which had minerals and potential and was exploited from the get-go. And those instabilities that came from the exploitation and the division have multiplied into complexities that have caused instability and violence in Africa. Millions have died up until this point. So let's go back to South Africa. We've spoken about the DRC. We've spoken about Rwanda. We've spoken about M23. We've spoken about FDLR. Let's speak about South Africa and this military involvement. Last year, a parliamentary question was sent to the Minister of Defense. The question was number 107, and the date of publication of the question was 26 July 2024. It was asked by Andile Mkitama, and the question was as follows. He was meant to ask and asked whether the deployment of the members of the South African National Defense Force in the Southern African Development Community in the Democratic Republic of Congo serves the country's national interests. If not, what is the position in this regard? If so, what are the relevant details? He got an answer from then minister, and it said as follows. Accordingly, South Africa has a role to play in the DRC, which is characterized by a general state of instability and, in particular, the presence of rebel groups such as the M23, who have rendered the mineral-rich country ungovernable, especially in the eastern DRC. This has resulted in untold misery for women and children and has also displaced many communities. Instability, violence against the Congolese, rape and famine in this rich country have not only caught the attention and empathy of the international community through the United Nations, but also that of the SADC collective, whose leadership through the Troika called for the deployment of troops by member states through the SADC mission in the DRC. Instead of looking away, South Africa heeded the call and commenced with the deployment of around 2,000 troops as part of this force. South Africa has, through its foreign policy, embraced multilateralism as an approach to solve challenges confronting the international community, the continent, and the region included. South Africa is in any event a beneficiary of regional and continental solidarity, without which it would not have achieved its freedom and relative stability. National interests articulated in the 2011 foreign policy do not only involve promoting the well-being and development and upliftment of South Africa's people, but protecting the planet for future generations and ensuring the prosperity of the country, but also pursue the same goals for the region and the continent. The South African National Policy on Defense, the Defense Review 2015, articulates South Africa's position of global influence, which essentially corresponds with its geopolitical position as a global power. It states that South Africa, as a major power on the continent, may be required to respond to circumstances of political security or societal conflict, including the potential for such conflicts to rapidly escalate to armed conflict. The idiom suggesting that charity begins at home cannot be negated when a call is made by both the UN and the SADC Troika to contribute to the stability of the DRC. The foreign policy is clear that the struggle for a better life on the home front, South Africa, is intertwined with our pursuit of a better Africa in a better world. South Africa's destiny as a nation state is inextricably linked to that of the Southern African region. Peace, stability, and security are essential preconditions for development, not only in South Africa, but in any country where human beings are organized in an internationally recognized polity, including the DRC. The national policy on defense further makes provision for the utilization of the country's military resources in multinational peace missions. South Africa must be able to participate in multinational peace missions on the continent and should also be able to contribute to multinational peace enforcement operations in the case of significant interstate or intrastate conflict. Such involvement and scale thereof would be discretionary, being determined by the specific situation and subject to other priorities. Defense force deployments beyond Africa will be exceptional and of a limited scale and duration. In general, threats to security closer to South Africa will enjoy priority. Force levels deployed in the DRC are informed by the nature and the extent of the threat against the Congolese and, by extension, the SADC collective, part of which South Africa is included. Given the above South African position as articulated by foreign policy, the Defense Review 2015, and pronouncements of the President of the Republic and Commander-in-Chief of the South African National Defense Forces addressed by President Cyril Ramaphosa on South Africa's foreign policy 20 August 2023, it's very clear. The growth and success of the South African economy is further intrinsically dependent on enduring peace, stability, economic development, and deepened democracy on the continent. These deployments are essentially directed by the SADC collective leadership, part of which South Africa is not only included, but a lead and framework country consistent with its geopolitical position and gravitas in the region and on the continent. So that was the answer to the question from Andile Mkutama. Right? Now, let's think about all of this. Since the announcement about the deaths of the South African soldiers, there have been political parties which have called for a return to the troops, South African political parties, saying that it's not South Africa's war. There have been some who have argued that the DRC is not geographically close to South Africa and that focus should have been on other countries like Mozambique. The discussion goes that South Africa seems to be fully committed to taking a position and acting on that position in ways that they were not committed to doing when the SADC election observer mission said that there were irregularities in elections in Zimbabwe, that they were not committed to doing in Mozambique. So it seems as if there's been an inconsistency in that regard. Julius Malema has said that if the troops are not adequately supplied, that they should come back home. The DRC has said it's a civil war that has nothing to do with South Africa. Not the DRC, the Democratic Alliance, sorry. And we've seen General Bantu Holomisa raising issues around funding and support for the armed forces. He wasn't very aggressive, but even in the past, he's raised issues of budget around the support for the South African National Defense Forces. So that's been part of the conversation. I wonder where you stand, because you can see that this issue is multifaceted, very sensitive, involves a lot of countries. I didn't even talk about China, because China owns a mine in the DRC, which is apparently the size of Los Angeles. That's the size of the mine that they own. And it's a mine there that they're getting cobalt from, right? Others have spoken about the mineral interests that South Africa itself has, and why the DRC is on the foreign policy priority list, with the resources being committed in this manner, because several South African mining companies could be affected by a change in leadership in the Eastern DRC. So there are some examples that are worth considering about mining companies operating in the DRC broadly, some of which have interests in the Eastern DRC, but not all. And DRC is large. You must remember that, right? It's a very large country, but it's still one country under one government, right? So if you have interests one side of the country, whatever happens in DRC, change in leadership in DRC also affects you. And you've seen from the first Congo War that change in leadership can happen as a result of conflict, because we saw that in the first Congo War, second Congo War, with the assassination of the president in second Congo War, right? So Glencore, right? Glencore, it has operations in the DRC. Glencore is one of the largest producers and marketers of copper. Glencore is an international mining company, but Ivan Glassenberg, a South African citizen, is one of the largest individual shareholders. He owns about 15% of the company. And he is someone who has very close relationships with South African politicians, particularly President Cyril Ramaphosa. Glencore operates the Mutanda mine, which is an integrated producer of copper and cobalt in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Mr. Ramaphosa and Glencore have had commercial relationships from 2005 up until 2014. He was the equity partner for Glencore through his company Shanduka. Glencore and Shanduka had various projects that they were working on, Optimum coal mine being another example, right? And he has known, Mr. Ramaphosa has known Ivan Glassenberg, I think, for over 35 years. They've had a relationship. Glassenberg called him a friend, somebody who's very close to him. Glencore also mines and processes copper ore at the Kamoto Copper Company, which is also located in the DRC. And you must remember that Glencore has paid fines, billions in fines, for corrupt activities in the DRC. They even paid the government of the DRC 3.4 billion rands recently, 181 million US dollars, for corruption in the DRC, bribing officials to get contracts, that kind of thing. So this is not necessarily a company that is beyond, using political pressure to try to get their interests achieved. But it's a company that has links to South Africa that is operating in the DRC. It's worth noting and being aware of. It's a factual thing. Another example, Afri Mineral Holdings Group is a South African mining company that focuses on various mineral resources, primarily in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It also has links to ANC prominent people. Zwelakhe Sisulu, who has passed on, was the executive chairperson of Afri Minerals at some point. And that company is involved in the exploration and production of minerals such as cobalt and copper in the DRC, which are abundant there. The company aims to leverage the rich mineral deposits in the region to advance its portfolio. That's on their website. Right, another example, Velapanda Holdings, led by Tokyo Sehwale, also made significant investments in various sectors, including mining in the DRC, involved in copper and cobalt mining projects in the Eastern DRC. Another example that is relevant to be aware of, just to see the political connections and to see the South African interest. Anglo Gold Ashanti is one of the biggest mining companies in the DRC. They're actually one of the largest gold producers in the DRC. If you recall, Maria Ramos was actually chairperson of Anglo Gold Ashanti. She stepped down last year. So that's another prominent mining company that has links to South Africa, Anglo Gold Ashanti. Another example, 2016, a company known as Ivanhoe Mining announced the Kamoa Kakula project in the DRC. This is the largest copper discovery ever made in the history of mining on the African continent. In 2018, Kgalema Motlanthe, the former president of South Africa, joined the board of Ivanhoe Mining, right? For those watching from outside South Africa, and there are many people who are watching from outside South Africa, thank you for watching. Kgalema Motlanthe served as the third president of South Africa for about less than a year, from 25 September 2008 to 9 May 2009. And this was following the resignation of Thabo Mbeki. He was basically the caretaker president in between Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma after the Polokwane conference went badly for Thabo Mbeki and the Zuma grouping was rising. He remains a very influential figure in South African politics, and his foundation hosts a mini Davos type of think tank event called the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation Drakensberg Inclusive Growth Forum. That's a mouthful, right? Where prominent scholars and prominent government officials, including the Minister of Finance, have spoken at those events, attended, made presentations. So it must be relatively clear from all of these examples that there are significant South African interests, mining interests in the DRC, and that those mining interests sometimes converge with political interests. And that's just something that we have to be aware of. But on the Rwandan side, it's very clear, right, that Paul Kagame also has interest in that particular region, and that he's somebody who is not necessarily a Democrat, right? Paul Kagame wins elections 98%, 98%, 99%. He's a dictator. The question of whether he's a benevolent dictator is another question, but Paul Kagame is a dictator in Rwanda, no matter how clean Kigali is. And we saw the former and late Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, praising Kigali, praising the cleanliness of Rwanda. We've seen that Kagame has good relations with the UK and the USA, but be that as it may, he's still somebody who is basically a dictator. And you can see from looking at all of this that there are no clean hands in the DRC. I don't think that there are clean hands in the DRC. When I looked at this whole thing, I've been speaking to you now for close to an hour. I don't think there are any clean hands in the DRC. There's this question that has been asked about what is the nature of this mission, the SAMI DRC. And there's a document that is circulating which discusses the nature of the SAMI DRC. And it's from one of the reports from SADC. And this is what it says. SADC endorsed the deployment of the SADC mission in the DRC, SAMI DRC, for an initial period of 12 months, subject to extension for further periods depending on the evolution of the security situation on the ground, following an assessment consisting of brigade plus force with critical maritime, air, artillery support capabilities, logistical support, road transport capabilities, repair and recovery capabilities, casualties, medical evacuation, intelligence acquisition means, and quick reaction force in support of the DRC under Scenario 6 of the SADC Standby Force, with the mandate to, and this is what was part of the debate, what is the role of this? Is it a peacekeeping mission or is it not? Support of the Democratic Republic of Congo to neutralize negative forces and armed groups in the Eastern DRC in order to restore and maintain peace and security, to create a secure environment, to support the FARDC, the DRC National Army, by providing logistic land, air, and maritime assistance in order to enhance its military operational capabilities, to provide support to the efforts of the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo to continue creating a conducive environment for humanitarian assistance and providing humanitarian relief to the population affected by the military and paramilitary activities in the Eastern DRC, including internally displaced persons, to protect, listen to this one now, protect critical infrastructure in the Eastern DRC, which is mines, and to protect civilians and their properties under imminent threat of attacks. So one of the big questions that was being discussed in this particular matter is, what is the nature of SAMI DRC? So this mission clearly is not a peacekeeping mission. It's not based on SADC documents in and of themselves. It's not a peacekeeping mission. So then the question is, what now? what must be done? I think that there's need for very strong, robust journalism to get to the bottom of who killed the South African soldiers. The president of Rwanda is saying it was not M23. Obviously, M23 is backed by Rwanda. The South African president said it was. That's not, those two cannot mutually exist. There's also been footage of mercenaries who apparently surrendered and they're coming from Europe. They've been fighting with DRC. All of these things need to be resolved. We need full information. In terms of should the troops withdraw, the South African troops, it's not an easy question. It's not an easy question. Because on the one hand, it's very clear that South African businesses and some politicians have some form of interest in the DRC. On the other side, it's also clear that the M23 movement and the rebels have concerns about the treatment of Tutsis. And following the genocide, that is not something that we can just ignore. It's also clear that Rwanda, Uganda have caused problems in terms of their involvement in DRC. And these problems go back. And they've been involved in the instability in the DRC. It's clear as well that the UN mission has not succeeded. It didn't succeed in Rwanda. It's not working in Uganda. Not in Uganda, sorry, in the DRC. Part of this problem, even the DRC president at some point called for the UN mission to leave MONUSCO, to leave DRC. It's not an easy issue. It's not an easy issue. And I think we'll all have to think carefully about it. There needs to be some kind of a peace process. There have been peace processes. There have been so many peace processes. And it seems to me we haven't even had a chance to talk about the foreign influence from overseas, America, China. These other entities want this cobalt for cheap. Apple computers, all of these iPhones, these Samsung devices, Android, Tesla, you name it. All of them rely on the DRC for cheap minerals. So I hope where we are right now, because I'm not providing a full answer. I don't want to be perceived as taking sides, etc., etc. We have to think about where we are right now. And there are still questions that need to be answered, but it's a very delicate moment. It's a very delicate moment. If I could draft a peace process, what would I do? I would say Rwandan forces must leave. I would say South African forces must leave. I would say there needs to be a peace process that involves the FDLR, a peace process that involves the M23, a peace process that involves the government of the DRC, and also that involves Paul Kagame, because of this issue of the FDLR wanting to overthrow Rwanda and the government of Rwanda. That puts him immediately on the defensive in a way that Putin has always been on the defensive. In fact, some of what Putin has done in Ukraine, which South Africa supports to a degree, is being done by Paul Kagame. So there's a contradiction as it gets closer. One of my biggest concerns in all of this is that there's been a lot of energy from SADC for DRC, and it seems to be because of the minerals. And that energy has not existed in compromised elections in Malawi, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique. So some of this rhetoric doesn't ring true to me. I'm skeptical. And I don't want to lie to you guys. I don't want to seem overly on one side or any other side. But when I think about this, I just think this is a very big mess. And we could be going to a point where now we're going to another Congo war. But we really can't afford to keep having instability in the DRC. None of this benefits the people on the ground. None of this. The exploitation of cobalt, the fights between politicians, the fights between powerful, rich people, the fight between the Eastern African community and the SADC community, none of this benefits people on the ground. And that's the real tragedy in all of this. This is not making Africa richer. This is making Africa poorer. This is making Africa more divided. It's very disheartening. Sorry to leave it on that note, but that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Thanks so much for watching. This was a bit of a long episode because this topic is so big, so heavy. But thank you. I appreciate you watching. Till the next one. And I'm going to keep unpacking this because I think it needs a part 2. Let's call this part 1.